Hello everyone, my name is Arnaud Devaley and I was asked by the Center for Geostrategic Studies to discuss the instances of religious persecution going on in Ukraine through the prism of national and international law. Let us begin by recalling how important religion has played a role throughout history and in many, if not most, countries. We can go back to the adoption by Rome of Christianity, in the wake of which, in the 4th century, Christianity became a global religion. This interconnection between the temporal and the spiritual lasted for centuries and allowed for a sense of unity, whether it's in the West all the way to 1051 and the schism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, bearing on the Rome having an intimate role in the anointing of monarchs in Western Europe, or in the East with the fusion between the Tsar and the Patriarch. And so religion has always, as I said, played an important role, intricate role in the political entities that have risen and disappeared throughout the centuries. In the case of Catholicism, starting in the early 16th century, there was this reform movement, which for the first time in centuries saw two variations competing for the same political entities. This obviously led to many political strife, culminating in the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, which saw the downfall of the Habsburg Empire and the rise of the Bourbon monarchy of France. Catholicism was also an important factor during the adoption by the British Crown of what became known as Anglican Church, and Henry VIII was instrumental in this repudiation of Catholicism and the adoption of Anglican Church for, some would say, parochial reason. Excuse my French, but fact remains that to this day the official religion in the UK is Anglican Church, the Anglican Church. Things took a significant turn under Napoleon when in 1801 the Napoleonic regime installed what came to be known as the Concordat, which for the first time saw a temporal entity, political entity, codify essentially the cohabitation of several religions under one territory, in one territory, i.e. Christianity and Judaism. And this became essentially important in what way? In the way that the state declared itself to be independent from religious orders. And so the secular order was born, essentially. And we saw this phenomenon repeat itself throughout the world, in certain variation to be sure, but this was a very important stage, and to this day, modern republics tend to codify the freedom of religion, although the state itself is non-religious. We see it in countries like Syria, which adopted the civil law system, whereas the state is technically non-religious, but it enforces the right of many to follow and abide by their own respective religions. So this takes us to essentially the situation in Ukraine, which is the latest uh, expression of the use of religion as a mean of political control. As many of you will undoubtedly know, Ukraine, or should I say ex-Ukraine, is undergoing tremendous changes, for sure these last 30 years, but more so these last 10 years. And the central authorities of Kiev have attempted to essentially engage in a policy of deliberate discrimination against their fellow countrymen of ethnic Russian origin, Russian speaking. And this concerted and calculated policy of discrimination has now extended since 2018 to a religious component. And in so doing, Kiev, under Western influence, was nudged in basically repudiating the Patriarchate of Moscow, of the Orthodox Church in Moscow, in favor of the Patriarchate from Constantinople. This has given way to, in the wake of the special military operation, to a basically an escalation in religious persecution, with priests from the Orthodox faith claiming to follow the Patriarchate of Moscow being harassed, beaten, prohibited from performing Mass, and for the followers of that faith, essentially being prevented from performing the rites, going from public service in the churches to burying their dead in under that particular denomination, and preventing some of the faithful from even accessing to some of their most holiest site. So how does this translate as far as legal provisions? Well, let us start with the Ukrainian constitution. The Ukrainian constitution, which was adopted in 1996, underwent some amendments which were initially for a time rejected in order to then be reincorporated afterward. But suffice it to say that the constitutional order that officially prevails in today's Ukraine incorporates, of course, the freedom of religion in Article 24 and 35. So Ukraine, as such, has completely departed from its constitutional framework, and this explains, inter alia, why a good third of the population of this country decided to follow their own destiny, essentially, and exercise their right of self-determination when they realized early on, owing to the violation of their right to practice the Russian language and having their children taught in Russian language, that the old constitutional order had essentially been done away in the wake of the so-called Revolution of Dignity. If we move on to the international stage, we will see that the freedom of religion, the freedom of cult, is enshrined in most regional, i.e. continental, human rights documents, whether it's the European Convention on Human Rights, which provides the right to perform and religious freedom in its Article 9, that this document essentially concerns 46 countries in Europe, which are mandated to abide by its provision, and that includes Ukraine. So under European law, Ukraine, which has pretenses to one day join the European Union, is in clear violation of this document. But we also find this prohibition on violating the rights, violating the rights of religious freedom in the Inter-American Convention also known as the Pact of San Jose, which in its Article 15 prohibits expressly any kind of incitement to violence leading to an illegal act punishable by law. This Article 15 is actually to be read in conjunction with Article 20 of the ICCPR, the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights of the UN, to which essentially every UN member state abides by when they join the community of the UN member states. We also find the prohibition on discrimination on religious ground in the African Charter on Human Rights, also known as the Banjul Charter, Article 8. And of course, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, calls for religious freedom to be enshrined in its main provision, Article 18. And if we look at the ICCPR itself, we see that religious freedom is mentioned among those fundamental rights that are listed between Article 12, 13, 17, up to 24. So religious freedom is a tried and true fundamental tenet of human rights. It's been recognized as such under all latitudes, and in that sense, there is no derogation to it. In U.S. law, since the U.S. Turns out to play an important role in what goes on in Ukraine these days, at federal law, the 1997 Freedom from Religious Persecution Act, which, interestingly enough, in its Section 7, I quote, prohibits federal agencies from exporting goods, services to countries that are engaged in religious persecution. To be sure, that act was adopted by Congress during the day of the Sudan civil war, but it has an application worldwide. Section 7 also mandates that there shall not be any U.S. and or multilateral assistance to such country. And that includes issuing visa to representative of the country which is known to engage in religious persecution, which brings the question, why isn't this provision, this federal statute, invoked by people who might be likely living in the U.S. to have standing and bring into account some of the officials of the Ukrainian regime. Last but not least, the International Criminal Court, in its Article 7, subsection 1, has basically incorporated religious persecution under the more general heading of crime against humanity. This was done essentially in a case called the Al-Hassan case, which was a case of religious persecution in Mali in 2019, and that basically explicitly now lists religious persecution as a crime against humanity. Now, the problem with Ukraine technically is that it's not the member signatory of the Rome Treaty, which is the statute of the ICC. However, Kiev has issued a permission to the ICC prosecutor to come and investigate alleged crimes that might have occurred allegedly in the wake of the special military operation. So this would basically open the door for the prosecutor of the ICC to look into instances of religious persecution, as it is mentioned now under Article 7, subsection 1 of the statute, and potentially field communications and look into instances of such practices, with a view to maybe prepare a file for a pre-trial chamber. So let's not hold our breath, but this is something that could be done. Otherwise, I would suggest that it would behoove a lot of national jurisdiction to adopt national legislation bearing on religious persecution, in specific instances bearing maybe on the conflict in Ukraine, and basically internalize in their national domestic laws the criminalization and the persecution of what we are seeing now going on in the Ukraine. It is, of course, for political reasons unlikely to take place, but through lobbying, it might be possible to have such bills introduced in national parliaments in the West. So to be sure, this is going to be a long fight, but whether it's in the US, in federal law, or through national legislation, or again, if someone living on the Ukrainian territory, ex-Ukrainian territory, shall we say, who's been victim of religious persecution, they might be able to file a communication with the ICC prosecutor by virtue of Ukraine inviting the ICC to conduct investigation on its territory. Thank you very much.